Can someone confirm if I'm audible now? I think I wasn't earlier.
Completely audible.
Cool, cool. Shout outs at the end. Saksham going as Prime Minister. POS by raise of hand. Anytime, preferably after 5th. I'll take at least one. Starting speech. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. The only logical scenario this debate can operate in is a situation where Maduro has lost the elections. You won't be detaining people otherwise. You won't let your government or won't let your country go to shit or won't let your entire how people view you as a president go to shit simply because you won the elections and you're too I don't know what to release the results or whatever. We think you would simply release the results on the comparative if you had won the elections fair and square. Op necessarily needs to prove why that's not the case to prove any other comparative they want to bring up in this debate. But also ask it in the POI if you're good people. I know you are. But then, what's a positive material? Firstly, on the idea of international pressures, we think trade agreements such as treaties, which are probably ratified or probably which are renewed every 5, 6, 7 years in regular durations, are something you opt out of necessarily simply because countries just don't view you as a legitimate president anymore. And that is something that is extremely taxing for the economy because Venezuela is not that great of an economy, which is still dependent on countries such as USA, etc., which probably don't recognize you as a legitimate democracy anymore. And the problem with that is things you opted into earlier, which probably looks like United Nations or it probably looks like benefits from international organizations, or something which you naturally are out of the ambit of simply because you aren't recognized as a valid democracy or a country which probably lives by the principles of democracy. USA being probably the flag bearer of democracy in the world is something which probably forces it to, but also it has pressures to not go ahead and support you, but has pressures to condemn you at all points in time simply because it has to preserve its image as the flag bearer of democracy. But secondly, we think military support from more developed economies like USA, etc., which provide you weapons like tanks, guns, fighter jets, helping you defend yourself from external attackers which look like terrorist groups originating from both within and outside the government, are something you actively lose out on. Why is these things something that is extremely important, A, for your security of your own nation, but also for more and more companies to actually actively come and invest in your country, but also for you to ensure the security of your entire population in of itself. Why you won't get such kind of military support is simply because you're going ahead and persecuting your own people and detaining your own people with this kind of military support that these governments had given you in the past, etc. Therefore, you actively are let out of such kind of agreements in status quo. But thirdly, we think worker exchanges between geographically and culturally proximate countries is something that becomes unlikely, and that is why people probably lose their jobs because people travel, especially in Latin American countries, travel between borders and cross borders regularly to probably go to job or to probably for some sort of time limited projects, etc. At that point in time, you lose out on this extra revenue, but also you lose out on the support of people who lost their livelihood because such kind of ties were cut off from geographically proximate countries. But fourthly, within the grants and financial aid you could have generated from international organizations till these elections occurred, which are largely controlled by the US, which looks like which looks like International Monetary Fund or the World Bank having soft power of US, which basically looks like giving funding to organizations or giving funding to countries being dependent on whatever US wants because it has people up in there in the top management of such kind of international organizations in the first place. We think this kind of tip over or this kind of non-cooperation between other powers and Venezuela is something that poses a friction in not just your internal functioning but also your position as a country in the world. But secondly, on the idea of national stability, and it is extremely important. First, we think the constant socio-political instability in terms of opposition party calling you out and having such kind of public public probably protest or public claims that they've won with a landslide and you are probably a dictator who is just sitting up on the throne. Those kinds of things are problematic simply because the kind of narrative that is set or the kind of way people view you is something as a dictator. We think people at that point who are not even interested in politics probably do give a shit because their lives are affected by whatever policy you go ahead and make. An illegitimate president or prime minister probably ruling my country is something that I do give a shit about simply because that any policy or decision they take probably affects my life. At that point in time, I also develop an incentive to go ahead and protest on the roads, probably looking like vandalism or crimes or other things which makes me want to preserve my own livelihood, etc. But secondly, we think your political party members try to leave your political party and your government in of itself because the threat to their lives and the respect they hold in society simply because people probably uproar against your entire political party, which looks like your family members of the people within your party, etc. And at that kind of time, we think your government is slowly falling apart simply because people want to still exist within that society that you're currently heading, etc. But third, we think low economic investment. We think insofar as civil protest or this kind of detaining something that is extremely likely in this particular setting, we think companies don't invest their don't open up their branches or invest within that country, or companies which are currently invested probably out or pull out their funds. And this is important. And this is important simply because the economic revenue that you were deriving for you to rule a country peacefully or to rule a country to fruition is something that goes away simply because low economic investment exists. But then you are unlawfully detaining people, which means you have limited capacity in prisons, etc. Randomly imprisoning 2,400 people is something that probably you hadn't anticipated. Therefore, you didn't build prisons already, which basically have limited resources, limited infrastructure. At that point in time, there is a boiling point where probably you can't arrest people anymore, or there is a boiling point where probably international organizations will be forced to militarily intervene because they can't have any more human rights violations or those kind of things. At that point in time, we think this is a further added harm to your security as a nation in of itself. But finally, civil unrest and protests become more prevalent in a country. You don't want that because of reasons I already mentioned. Before I move on, I'll take that to you.
Context slide explicitly mentions that the opposition is just as skeptical of this re-election as is the Maduro regime. Why do you think the opposition is so skeptical about this?
Tell that in your speech. But also, at the end of both these arguments, we conclude that you are probably currently indisposed to run the country in the current situation because neither you have international support, but also you aren't able to lead the country in its current form, in the current situation you exist in. Which basically means you are leading towards a failed government, ultimately leading to being incapable of ever coming into power again. As Maduro, you wouldn't want that. You would want a positive tenure probably, or coming into power later, which basically means conducting re-elections is something that gives you if not a guaranteed but a 50-50 chance you'll win elections. What happens if you have a failed government, or if probably some other country militarily intervenes? You have nothing to show on your record, which basically means you can never get re-elected in the future. Currently you have the chance to probably change the narratives and to probably have a decent chance at winning the new elections. But then, why do we think re-elections are better? Multiple reasons. One, we think the legitimacy of newly elected government is something that will be recognized by other countries and recognized by the people itself, which is important simply because your legitimacy is re-intact. You can probably enact policies normally. Companies will probably come and invest in your country. But second, we think aid from international organizations is probably you can get in the future simply because you have a new elected government. But finally, we think you prevent military intervention from peacekeeping forces and other powerful countries such as the USA, such as other countries that I mentioned in the context slide, from attacking you at all points in time. We think these reasons are extremely important for you to regain your legitimacy and international positioning in the world, and that is something we probably give a shit about because we just want a formally globally viewed elections being conducted regardless of who wins. We don't give a shit about that. We think elections, regardless of the result, are a win for the country as a whole, but also for Maduro. Extremely proud to propose.
19 p.m. calling upon Elu.
Also, sorry, before that, let's just give shout out real quick. A big shout out to SRCC Depsog. Last final I was in was also an SRCC finals. Extremely proud. Organizing Rahat is something we did last year. It's just as great. It's just the same vibe. Thanks to Aditya and Khushi for teaming up. We didn't have a teammate until 2 hours before the tournament. From there to reaching finals. Shout out to Manya, my sister, who's probably also specking. Shout out to Mahesh also. He was our first teammate for Rahat, but then went on to Cap. Cool. Hello, hello.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Cool. This is Shreya going as hello. I'll try to take a POI around the 5th minute. If I don't take one, interrupt me before the predicted time. Again, shout outs at the end. Starting my speech on a self count of 3, 2, 1. For anything valuable to stand in Saksham's speech, he had to prove two things. A, why US is suddenly pro-Venezuela when US has been anti-Venezuela for, say, the past 20 years, irrespective of the government which is there in power, right? Secondly, they go ahead and say that, oh, you'll get defense help from US and you'll get military support from international organization. They had to go ahead and prove the likelihood of defense support being received from US in a volatile economy which is facing severe economic crisis, hyperinflation and things like that, but also an economy which has extreme governments, right? For that to stand then, we need to provide some context. We think that Venezuelan economy, again, irrespective of the hyperinflation or economic crisis it's going through, also has a largely polarized voter base. This polarized voter base looks like that governments and parties are either far left or they are far right. We do not think that we have a moderate option available who can actually provide the benefits which Saksham talks about in his speech, such as increasing employment or solving economic crisis and things like that. We think that for you to go ahead and prove that, you had to necessarily prove A, that Maduro will not come to power again, but B, you had to prove that the other government or the opposition party which comes in power is not extremist, and the far right policies of the other government are not in collusion with the United States in the first place. Then what then is our case? We think that re-elections will be extremely harmful to not only the country but also to Maduro's regime in the long run as well in the short run. We need to understand that skepticism is something which exists in the status quo, right? Which means both opposition party and Maduro are skeptical about elections. Let's understand the reasons. Why is the opposition skeptical? We think that the opposition is skeptical because they are almost sure that Maduro will go ahead and rig the elections again if he has rigged the elections once, right? Which means they are skeptical about their ability to not only come in power but also their ability to manage the country if they go ahead and come in power, simply because they think that the crackdowns will continue due to the far influence of Maduro's influence on Venezuelan politics in and of itself. Then we think that rigging of elections is something which is likely to exist in the status quo. With that being said, that we think that Maduro's government is again skeptical of the elections for reasons which are obvious. They aren't sure if they are going to come in power again, but also they don't know the efficacy of their crackdowns. We think that these are largely uncertain things, which has led to a condition of instant turmoil and chaos in the economy of Venezuela. We think the economic crisis of Venezuela, and Venezuela is going through tough times already, right? Which means it has extremely limited resources. The oil reserves which it had and which were the major source of all its revenues have been imposed. Have been subject to sanctions by US since like many years down the line. So it's not this regime which is exclusively facing sanctions. It's like I don't know the but Hugo Chavez came into power and US imposed elections. Venezuela was ruled by military for some time. US imposed elections. We think that US has continuously imposed elections on Venezuelan economy for a long period of time until they are directly able to go ahead and have a control over the oil reserves which Venezuela possesses. Then, with in light of this information, then we think that conducting elections is bad because you have huge chances of straw manning again, right? Which means you have even more straw manning, you have even more human rights violation, you have people protesting and people dying again because Maduro came into power again. But also if Maduro didn't came into power, probably another person who's posing to be a democratic leader becomes a dictator just because of the lack of opposition which exists in the Venezuelan economy if sanctions are imposed on Maduro as a whole by the US government. Then we think the legitimacy of political party is a fair point raised by Saksham, and we think the legitimacy is greater on our side. Why? We think unstable governments are rarely legitimate, right? Which means at a point in time he says that probably when a government comes up they'll be stable. No, if Maduro comes into power again, US will question it again. It become a vicious cycle, which means re-elections happen, protests happen, human right violations and crackdowns continue to happen. But if this person Maduro does not come into power, opposition party's leader, he comes into power, we think that rigging of elections and strong manning is something which is still likely to exist, right? Which means if Maduro is still someone who has political aspirations, he'll still continue to go ahead and shape the narratives which are existing in Venezuela in and of itself, right? Which means there'll be constant plotting as to take down the opposition from the power that they have speculatively received on government's paradigm, which is again extremely unlikely then. So even in our worst case scenario where Maduro is thrown down and opposition actually comes up and they are good people, we think there'll be constant pushes by Maduro's regime in and of itself to throw that opposition out of power. And this is the kind of dictatorship environment of Venezuelan economy itself has seen multiple leaders, Hugo Chavez, Maduro, and many other leaders whose name I do not remember, who have constantly done things like crackdowns and they'll do anything to bring down the opposition in power. We think it leads to an extremely unstable government, which is not good for the economy because it leads to and it exacerbates the economic crisis even more. Prices shoot up even more. People are not able to afford even basic necessities of life. Then what do we think is a better alternative? We think that instead of making Venezuela an extremely conflict prone environment like Iran as US did in the past, it's better to reduce the amount of crackdowns by pub, pressuring the existing government of Maduro to go lenient on the kind of socialist or communist ideas that that this person has, right? Which means in past, if you go ahead and remove sanctions and try to diplomatically engage with Maduro, the kind of there's likely to be an improvement in Venezuelan economy in the long run, where people are able to now make informed decision and able to go ahead and make decisions with regards to what is good for governance and whether or not they can go ahead and afford basic necessities in the long run. Then we think that you do not want you don't want another person who cracks down on people's authority, and killing the opposition of a party by involving external influences is not the correct way to do it. Our case is simple. If you go ahead and legitimize that, hey, you were the one who rigged elections, which is likely the case which will happen if re-elections are caused, it undermines your legitimacy. But also it gives external powers like US, who has already imposed sanctions on you since like years long, to go ahead and manipulate the opposition party and supply resources to the opposition party to go ahead and crack down even more and to come in power, which means there's a constant battle between opposition and the government, and there's a constant instability which will exist in the status quo. We don't think it will lead to a situation even in the near future where these conditions can be improved. Then we think we propose for a condition where Maduro grows more lenient, and Maduro is already caving into the pressure which are made by the capitalistic forces in sense of leniency towards socialist governments and things like that. We think these diplomatic measures work far more on our side. US is anyway not providing you defense help because they're skeptical. International organizations are again not providing you defense help because they're skeptical of the economic crisis your country is facing. Them at all points in time, you're not able to succeed in what you set out to do. With that, proud to oppose.
Um, I'm assuming you had to give shout outs.
Oh fuck, I'm sorry. Yeah,
Yeah.
I had to give shout out. Thank you for the reminder. Okay, first of all, Abel and Navakanth, the best teammates I could ask for, and whenever I team up with them, it's extremely fun, and we just have a blast. But also shout out to Saksham, Aditya, and Khushi, and shout out to SR Depsok. This is extremely amazing, and feeling extremely proud that we're debating in finals, being XOC in the last edition. Just that.
Perfect. Thanking Elo, calling upon DPM.
I will just take a minute. Hi, am I clearly audible? Cool. Shout outs during reply. Winning. If we are winning till then. Aditya, hear him going as DPM. POI is whenever, however. Just don't heckle, please. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I will just clear out the comparative which comes in the last minute of Shreya's speech. Why you becoming lenient is not an option. 3 reasons. 1, there have been multiple instances where the far right and far left party leader has tried to become moderate, leading to internal political disaster in the country, because you are not a single person authoritarian dictator. You are part of a party whose entire ideology is based on far leftism. At that point, if everything which Shreya says is true, and Shreya is the only one in this room who has spec, because all of us are shit in IR. If everything which she says is true, then it means that the entire party is probably hardliners of leftist. In that instance, there's a huge incentive of party fracturing to happen if their case stands, and you suddenly as Maduro start to become more moderate and more lenient towards this particular. This makes your party's rule even more unstable, because now the most hardline people among your party will probably switch parties, or will probably create internal fractions within the party, which makes it much more unstable, but also which increases the kinds of shouts or increases the appeals by opposition or parties or other independent observers to claim that your regime is illegitimate because people even within your regime is not really agreeing with the kind of policies which you are making on their side of the house. But a second reason why you cannot be moderate and lenient on their side is because of capitalist pressures, which again Shreya talks about. Notice what happens when the economy is in crisis. The people at the top probably self-prioritize themselves and probably go ahead and try to keep the interest or keep the sympathies of corporates and of companies, because these are the people who have funded their election in the first place. Which means if everything which she says is true, again because of the strong capitalist incentives and corporate lobby which is active by like oil magnates and oil MNCs in Venezuela, all of them would probably not want you to go lenient on opposition party, because coming up of a far right government in Venezuela is antithetical to the private profit making incentives of these corporations, which means they probably want Maduro to continue, and therefore they would not want opposition parties to get more legitimacy and to get more ammunition to call you out if you go ahead and become lenient on these protesters. But thirdly, there's a huge problem solution mismatch in the comparative, because what are these protesters there for? What are they demanding? They are demanding to see voting results, which I think both the sides agree you cannot do so simply because we have already failed this election. Otherwise, you would have done it much earlier to gain the recognition from other neighboring countries like Argentina, Chile, etc. The reason why you have still not done so is because you probably have lost. The implication of this is very simple. You not like you not punishing the protesters or you not arresting them will make them more emboldened to continue the protest and actually do it on a much larger and much more significant scale, because they do not want stability. These producers want even more instability in order to force you to step down as the government or to conduct a re-election, which means yes, opposition party probably do not are skeptical. The reason they are skeptical is because elections will probably be again be rigged. I'll come to that, why that's not a likely scenario in the second part of my speech. But notice right now, you becoming lenient does not automatically mean that protests stop, because what protesters want is for either you to release the voting result, which you cannot do on either side of the house. So the likely thing which is going to happen as a result of the Shreya's comparative in a protest become even more encouraged and emboldened, and the scale of protest and violent conflicts which is happening significantly increases on their side of the house. Notice this is the most certain and immediate harm as a result of the comparative, because on our side, at least for some time during the re-election period, the violence and conflicts is reduced, because people are still voting for the next election results and the kind of response and the kind of results it generates, which means we have some temporary buffered period of peace and stability on our side in an absolute worst case when the violence starts again. On their side, we do not even get this temporary buffer period, because you go ahead and become lenient, and therefore these protests exaggerate the problems. For all the reasons, the comparative just cannot stand, which means we are automatically winning because they cannot bring a new alternative at the end. But then the two things more I'll do. Firstly, I'll tell you why a re-election will actually lead to future stability and not the kind of re-emerging of violence which we have talked about. There are four mechanisms to this. The first mechanism to this is that if I don't know the Venezuela politics, but Shreya cannot be correct because of context that we had, that every voter is either far right or far left, because they are literally independent observers who are also commenting upon the legitimacy of this election given in context side, which means they are independent observers who probably people respect and who probably go ahead and are the forebearers or the objective assessees of whether the elections are conducted legitimately or not. We think that these people have incentives to ensure that the next election will be conducted legitimately. But also, secondly, we don't care about whether the next election will be rigged or not. We care is the next election will have legitimacy and will have all party support. Why is it likely? Because notice, Maduro regime does not want elections to happen, probably. The only case in which it will go ahead and have a re-election when there will be an all-party consensus or all-party agreement that yes, whatever be the results of the next election, we will agree to it. This is not very difficult and very difficult to imagine. We think in every country where you want to go ahead and remove the incumbent party and have re-election, there is an implicit assumption that you won't have a re-election because it obviously have some economic cost for the country and instability in the country, which means there will be an implicit assumption that you want to go ahead and approve of the result of whatever comes the next time. But thirdly, you will also have foreign legitimacy for the next elections of whoever wins. This is likely because of multiple reasons. One, US is you are far left, right? Which means if the next time opposition wins, which is probably rightist or far rightist, US will also going towards right and Argentina and multiple other countries are also becoming right-leaning. The implication is very simple. All of these countries have right now, on-site opposition have incentives to impose even heavier sanctions, even heavier protests, and like blocking Venezuela even more because of this conflicting ideologies. But if we have a neutral and like free and fair or relatively free and fair election next time, and probably a rightist or moderate party comes up, all of these incentives get cancelled out, and therefore we are much more likely to get more for foreign support on our side. But lastly, if everything which Shreya says is true, then it becomes even more urgent to conduct elections. Because what is Shreya's frame? You have a huge economic problem because of the sanctions which other countries are putting. Earlier it was just sanction. Now you have been completely blocked out because your government is not considered legitimate. Your government cannot even like negotiate on these sanctions. Your government cannot force or enter into new treaties with any of the Latin American countries. Fuck USA. US probably hates Venezuela on either side. But Argentina, Chile probably does not hate you and probably are dependent on you as co-Latin American countries for regular trade and commerce and employment and cross-border economic integration. For all of these reasons, people there's an urgency in the situation that you have to create take a buffer time and conduct re-elections, because if you don't do so, protest will increase significantly, economic conditions will deteriorate because the comparative does not work, and people will probably be worse off. For all of these reasons, proud to propose.
Thanking DPM, calling upon DLO.
Hello. Just give me 30 seconds. I'll start.
DLO.
Cool. Shout outs, I'll give now. I think Shreya's going to reply. I think it's insane that we've come to this finals. Shout out to Shreya, Navakanth, crazy teammates. We've been hanging out with the name Midgets from that time, and we've reached finals also. So say. Also, shout out to my mom and dad. I think they're specking this now. Shout out to my brother. Shout out to my Judies and Arshi as well. With that, preferred mode of POI via raise a hand option and like through chat as well. Oh yes, Saksham, Jha, Khushi, Arora, crazy people. We've gone against them in Iktala finals also. वहाँ पे थोड़ा गलत हुआ finals में तो let's see if we can turn. Cool. POIs after fifth, preferably. Don't verbalize or anything like that. With that, starting on a self count of 3, 2, and 1. If government can claim that probably people are dissatisfied and that this inherent dissatisfaction will lead to the toppling down of an entire government, I think the Maduro regime already knows that. Which means at all points in time, we can posit that the entire political party or the left-wing party that Maduro is representing also has the same kind of incentives to stay in power at all points in time. Which means, sure, a certain amount of policies might not lean towards their leftist ideology in the first place, but if at all points of time, if it's able to cater to staying in power for a longer period of time, we're unsure as to why the entire political party cannot come into consensus with regards to staying in power. Why is this political party so rational in the first place? I think in status quo, when you can see probably existing dictatorial powers such as probably Sri Lanka and Bangladesh being able to be like toppled down by like basic ground level people by virtue of protesting and things like that, I think it's fair for us to claim that probably the Maduro regime in and of itself is also averse to this kind of protesting and things like that. Which means that at all points in time, these guys also have an active incentive to probably ensure that protesting and things like that doesn't really happen in the first place. So at that point in time, I think it's fair for us to claim that you will have an incentive to become lenient on protesters or to go ahead and reach for like other kinds of opportunities wherein you get to stay in power for a longer period of time in and of itself, right? But like secondly, I tell you, protesters protest for a democratic process. We'll add some counter level analysis to that. We'll posit that probably other countries have different kind of motives in and of itself, which means at large, probably Argentina and Panama or other countries as such, if they are able to get something out of Venezuela through due process, we'll posit that they'll also be fine with the Maduro kind of regime in and of itself. What does this necessarily look like? We'll posit that at a point in time, the Maduro regime is able to pass policies that is able to cater to Panama or like other kinds of neighboring countries and all of their incentives. At all points in time, then the capacity for them to remain like averse to Venezuela and their economic benefits is likely to reduce within the long run in and of itself. But like on to USA, right? We posit that the American government has been constantly like persecuting Venezuela and its economy for a significant amount of time. We're unsure as to why America goes in and like reduces any kind of sanctions at all points in time off of Venezuela in and of itself. We'll posit that people at large who are going in and actively protesting against the Maduro government are doing so because of the existing economical conditions that they're living in, but also because this lack of democratic feeling is something that goes in and resonates with the idea that they probably don't have any kind of say in what the government is going in and doing at any point in time. We'll go ahead and posit at a point and Maduro is able to pass a couple of centralist policies or a couple of policies that probably ensure that people are living better lives by probably providing them certain amount of like affirmative action plans and things like that. At that point, then you'll be able to a certain degree, satiate the level of disinterest or dissatisfaction that your normal voter base is feeling at the end of it. But with that in place, right, what exactly do we posit to? We posit that one, you going ahead and conceding to a re-election is inherently bad because of like in context, like they specifically talk about how the opposition inherently is additionally like skeptical about the kind of re-election procedures in and of itself. And at that point in time, I think directly contradicts what Jha tells you, that other parties are likely to accept the results of the re-election in and of itself. We're unsure as to why this is true. We'll posit that opposition is just as much skeptical with regards to the kind of election procedures and things like that. Sure, if independent observers did exist from the get-go, why weren't they able to ensure the proper functioning of the election system in the first place? Why exactly do they suddenly go ahead and scrutinize the elections all the more further is something that government doesn't really prove to you within this particular debate. We'll posit that one, elections are inherently expensive, which means at all points in time when Venezuela is currently undergoing significant amount of sanctions and an economic crisis, them undergoing a significantly greater amount of expense incurring by virtue of a larger election procedure in and of itself is likely to drop the economy even further. But what is the additional level of analysis to that? We'll posit that at a point in time, we cannot really guarantee that elections happen perfectly well again, and people are inherently satisfied with the verdict because we posit that the Maduro regime is probably likely to release protesters if the other party wins in and of itself. At that point of time, the capacity for violence to happen is significantly higher because notice now people are significantly more dissatisfied because they have lesser economic like benefits to them because the government has spent a significant amount of its resources on another election altogether. At that point in time, you have greater amounts of violence. You have a greater amount of dissatisfaction within the current like political diaspora in and of itself. And at that point in time, we will posit the capacity for violence is likely to increase significantly on their side. The second line of argumentation that we bring to you is with regards to how you inherently lose legitimacy for the left party. Because at the point in time you concede or you say okay for another re-election, things like that, you concede that you actively rig these elections. What does this inherently lead to? It possibly leads to a lack of legitimacy for the leftist party or for the Maduro regime in and of itself. What this inherently does is pave the way for just the rightist party to exist in isolation. What this inherently does and why this is so necessarily bad for a country like Venezuela with a history of dictatorship, like people like Hugo Chavez and things like that, is it leads to an inherently greater amount of dictatorship in the long run. What this inherently does is now increase the level of violence, but also reduces any kind of alternative to the rightist group party by completely delegitimizing whatever the leftist party stands for at the end of the day. Well, the last idea of lack of legitimacy or how you end up losing legitimacy for Venezuela as a country. But before anything else,
Able, be reasonable. You cannot fiat that you will make policies which have improve economic condition of people, but also will appease Argentina and Chile, but also will be able to counter US sanctions, which will
No, you
worsen
can't
on
counter
both
US
sides.
actions. No, that's the thing. You can't necessarily counter US actions. US decides to continuously fuck you over on both sides of the world. What we're able to prove to you is at all points in time, we'll posit that Argentina and countries in neighboring to Venezuela still have a significant amount to gain from Venezuela, such as natural resources, such as oil and things like that. America still goes in and imports oil from Venezuela at cheaper rates in and of itself. This all happens in status quo, and at all points in time, we'll posit that Venezuela can still pose a great deal of advantage or benefits to like multiple other countries, probably by going ahead and reducing the kind of like import tariffs on like certain commodities from Argentina and things like that. What you're inherently doing here is you can make pacifist policies that goes ahead and satiates the common public that goes in and protests at all points in time. What you're inherently doing, but significantly and more exclusively on our side of the world, is you're reducing the opt-in into American narratives or opt-in from foreign pressures in and of itself. What you're doing on site government is you're conceding to foreign third-party interests. What this inherently does is reduce the kind of interest among Venezuelans within like the kind of autonomy that these people possess as a country in and of itself. What you're inherently doing is you're creating the kind of precedents that Venezuela changes on US crackdown. This inherently leads to an eventual loss of autonomy for Venezuela as a country altogether. When they go ahead and concede to other third party kind of like allegations that claim that the kind of elections that happen in Venezuela is unfair and is unfair at all points in time. Notice these accusations never really change regardless of who is contending for elections on both sides of the world. What we're able to do is you're increasing the level of like legitimacy that, or you're preserving the level of legitimacy that Venezuela as a country has with regards to its this thing, and reducing the kind of violence that is likely to accrue at all points in time, maintaining the level of economic like stability within that particular country. Very proud.
Thanking DLO, calling government whip.
Hi, just give me 10 seconds. Okay, before I begin, am I perfectly audible?
Yes, you are.
Great. I'll just give a few shout outs before I start my speech. I think saying yes to doing the tournament with Saksham and Aditya turned out to be a great tournament overall, but also very proud to debate in this final with both juniors being in the team and against in the team. I think very proud to see them all debate. Plus, again, special shout out to the super juniors. I think they've run a great Rahat. I think it's probably their first tournament, so super proud of how you ran it. Okay, with that, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, there are two major things that have come out in this debate. One being national stability and which side sort of tries to cater to it better, but two, the economic expense overall regarding Venezuela in the first place. Let's start with the two counterfactuals, right? What opposition goes there and tells you that they would try to have lenient policies so as to not get overturned and stay in power and all that incentive. Let's take that down. One, we think at a point of time this government has already started to lose the trust of the independent observers as well as the people. At a point in time, they have started to detain people in the first place. We think that the people have already sort of lost trust in the democratic election that took place, or in general, the sort of president that got formed in the first place. We think at that point of time, firstly, we don't see how them suddenly making lenient policies is likely to make people forget about the core reason that obviously the opposition also agrees is of it being not a democratic process in the first place, but two, their life has already suffered because of it in the first place, because they have been detained, they have lost their jobs, their families are being affected. Don't think people are so fickle to forget what has happened to them within that time already. But two, we think at any point of time, Aditya already told you this, right? We tell you that understand as soon as a party overall, which is far left in this case, suddenly decides to change its policy just to appease people, we think people are likely to see how that's working in the first place. But two, we think how it's likely to create fractions is even worse off for national stability. Understand how that works, right? We think at any point of time, when even according to Shreya, the voter base is very much polarized, we think even the voter base in the first place who probably would have voted for both the sides of in the election, we think they are also likely to get more in terms of protests, because this is not a policy that probably they also vote for in the first place. They vote for leftist and rightist policies, as Shreya Shreya tells you. But two, we think in and of itself, as long as the policies change, we think any sort of support, as Aditya tells you, that these elective parties also get from these corporations, all those incentives that they have, and the main ideology that they have in the first place causes fractions within parties in and of itself, which likely sees them like leaving this party, joining other parties, etc., etc. We think that in general gets bad for democracies or for these two parties at large in the first place. But two, their entire argument that comes in their previous speech is say now they'll cater to policies for like Argentina and Chile, and there is like trade and everything. Panel, two things here. One, we think that even those countries, one, they have already agreed to refuse to recognize Maduro as the president. At that point of time, we think they've already created a stand in the international policy level that, oh, we are not going to recognize them as the president, which in turn means, and that's how it pans out, right? They don't usually do treaties with them. We think at that point of time, just because they are incentivized to get into a policy, we think it's likely that they will face backlash because they are now starting to go against whatever they talk about, and those countries are not likely to do that because they want to stand on something that they express an opinion on. But two, at that point of time, why do we think re-election is likely or better in terms of just the country and legitimacy at large, irrespective of whoever wins? We think at any point of time, the incentive that they tell you that, oh, opposition probably is skeptic of a re-election because they are also they're aware that it could get rigged again. We think there could be other incentives at large, and this is not an assumption that they can run with, that it could get rigged again. We think the simple incentive that comes from the context slide is that they said that they had won, like their president had won with a landslide victory. Note panel, a simple incentive of not having a re-election could also just look like not getting a landslide victory, probably being very close, probably them not winning. But I think there are other incentives existing which are also to be considered, and they can't really run with that assumption in the first place. We think at any point of time, even if the opposition is just skeptic that, oh, because we are not getting a landslide victory and a mayor victory in the current election, we think Aditya's argumentation on why they're likely to agree still stands. Why do we think it's more likely that they will agree than what Abel tells you? We think at any point of time, even those two powers in the first hand, both of them would want to avoid a complete destruction of the country at large, a complete invasion of their autonomy from the other international organizations at large. That's something that Saksham already tells you. But we think at a point in time, both of them have an inherent incentive to go ahead and continue with some sort of structure in the country that they're following without a loss of autonomy or without a complete overturn, as you saw in Bangladesh. We think at that point of time, it's likelier that they both agree that whatever the election comes, they'll probably agree to it, because understand at any point of time, independent observers are there. Scrutiny is likely going to be increased in this re-election because there are already allegations of it rigged again. At that point of time, why do we think legitimacy gets improved significantly on our end? We think that at any point of time, when this particular government that has already sort of lost trust of the people because they have not already released voting data, we think at that point of time, just them agreeing to re-election doesn't necessarily mean them conceding, because understand they've already not agreed to go ahead and release data. Not sure why that's just very exclusive to them them agreeing to re-election. But two, we think at any point of time, we as in government, in the stakeholder, we only care about the legitimacy of the election process being better, which is to say what protesters were fighting about in the first place, or the country at large believing in the democracy for years to go on. We think at that point of time, whichever party wins, we think the legitimacy gets improved irrespective, because now there are stricter regulations. But at that point of time, we think, as Aditya tells you, we think if opposition wins, which is a far right party, we think anyway the country would get now US help, as Shreya points out, about how the politics works. But two, we think even then, I think people would then probably trust, because independent observers also felt that their party won. We think at any point of time, when Shreya tells you that, oh, Maduro, even if they lost and the opposition won, Maduro is going to like push a lot because of the stature that he has, we think he has already lost a lot of trust, which is why the opposition won. Don't see how that's going to lead to a lot of protests. But two, at that point of time, we think that even if there is re-election, already likelihood that there is not going to be rigged significantly at large. We think if this party wins again, we think they're likely to have more legitimacy to stand for themselves and probably go with the policies that they already have, which is to say now they don't have to, listen to a lot of backlash or be fearful of releasing voting data at large. POI, Abel.
Sure, people say that people think that you're a hypocrite because you've changed policies, but people's needs are being satiated because you're finally giving them free food or whatever it is.
Okay, another assumption they run with. Panel, at any point of time, they say that the country is already fucked, which means that it's already bad and people are still willing to go ahead and protest at large for a democratic process to come into place, which means they're still willing to lose their jobs, stand in protests, they're being detained, get detained, lose their lives, be fearful of what the government is doing to them, have like bad things done for their family, etc. They're still willing to do that, panel, which means their main feeling out outright, is that for the country? Because they are so suffered with what the country already is, and they don't want a democratic fallout being the last thing that happens to their country at a worst stage. We think at that point of time, the leniency of policy suddenly is not something that's going to appease the people, because understand they've already been living in that scenario for far much stage and are willing to go ahead to an extent to get prison at that point of time. We think why legitimacy getting improved is in itself better, because we don't think that it means losing to other parties. It just means losing to third parties, so to say, because it just means giving into what the people wanted in the first place, standing for them. We think that's likely to put a better message to people, to appease people in the first place, to give them what they wanted. Doesn't necessarily mean that we're willing to push ourselves for US, because US didn't give a fuck already. It means giving in ourselves to the country at large and making sure legitimacy gets improved. A likely a chance for Maduro's government to probably gain better trust in a longer run and come back again, which is not happening when they're not when they're not giving into re-election. With that, very proud to propose.
Thanking government with, calling up with.
Yeah, just 10 seconds. Cool. So I don't reach finals often, so for lengthy shoutouts, because there's a lot of people who made this possible. Firstly, shout out to my mom for supporting me throughout. This would not have been possible without you. Yeah, she'll probably watch this debate tomorrow, so I hope I don't use any swear words. And secondly, shout out to Abel and Shreya for not just carrying me in this tournament, but also carrying me throughout my college life for past 2 years. Uh, Even if we don't win this, I probably have one, two true friends, so that's enough. And yeah, third, I think shout out to uh, Saksham, Jha, and Khushi. Probably the same time, like last year, we went to Lloyd, me, Abel, Shreya, and Saksham, Jha, Khushi, and both of us didn't break. But I think they broke reserve at least. So from there to reach finals and then debate against each other, yeah, very proud. And lastly, yeah, shout out to generations of SRCC depth, so those who are my juniors who are like conducting this tournament, and my senior who is just gave a speech before me. Yeah, so really proud of everything. Cool. Starting my speech in three. Thank you, Karthik. 3, 2, 1. The problem with Gov is that they are debating in isolationist. They say that, oh, the context slide mentions that US has blocked you, Panama has blocked you, Chile has blocked you, right? I think that's literally the problem. You still have sympathizers among international community. You still have Russia, China supporting you. This is something that we are like pretty scared of, right? Because in and of itself, like you probably lose the support of those people. You probably lose the support of like those people who have been empathizing with Venezuela, who probably stand with Maduro. It's at that point where we lose even the significant and like small like international support that we are necessarily getting. Because I think then this debate is just about like three things, right? Where necessarily Venezuelan government have like better external legitimacy? Where does it have like better internal legitimacy? And lastly, where is it economically better off? Firstly, where is Venezuelan government externally like better external legitimacy, right? I think they don't have better legitimacy externally on both sides, because literally, right, everything that Shreya tells you, that US has been sanctioning like Venezuela for like past, and like US has not been like supporting, all these things stand true till now. Even a re-election, we can't necessarily go ahead and like fear that, oh, a re-election will probably lead to like better support and will probably lead to like US going ahead and embracing Venezuela and all that sort of thing. No, I think that's just uncertain on like both sides, and we are okay. And I think at that point, this debate has to be judged where at least the people in the country are like far better. What Jha tells you is that, oh, because the government or like because the election has been rigged, your party in of itself is like fractured, or like you can't necessarily have like a unified party in of itself. I think that I'll flip that, right? It happens more on their side when you probably go and say, hey, let's have a re-election, because literally the entire party and their main goal is to probably win election and to come to power and to stay in power and all that sort of thing. When you go and like concede that we probably would have done something wrong, it's at that point where like people within that party go ahead and like fracture. It's at that point where people lose trust in their own party in and of itself, or at least they feel that the party is not being standing true, not sort of thing. Because it like people who support party, for them it's like part of their identity. It's a political identity. When you feel that your party in of itself has done something wrong, not conceding even in software. It's at that point where you have fracturing. We don't know how fracturing happens on like their side. So at least on like internal legitimacy, you're probably far better on our side. But second, they say, oh, election, and there will probably be like peace and all sort of thing. It's not a ceasefire, right? It's still election, and there can still be like more radicalization. People who like one who lost that election, who lost the previous election, can still go ahead and like radicalize people. Oh, see, literally Maduro agreed that he did something wrong and trying to like create much more ruckus. But also, right, that some thing in like criminal justice, broken window philosophy. At the end of the day, if like you see these kind of like radicalization, you see like people are going ahead and like fighting. It's at that point where you feel that the entire there's just like chaos happening, and it probably happens far worse on their side because now the ones who are probably standing, who are defending Maduro, also feel that there was literally been something that's wrong. And it's at that point where they feel that they lose entire trust that they've kept in like government and like politics. But crucially, why do people protest? It's not necessarily that their political rights is something that have been abrogated. It's probably because there's like far more like lead up to it. They probably did not become economic. They don't have economic benefits. They don't have like good livelihood in of itself, and poverty and all unemployment and all that sort of thing. It's at that point where you feel even your vote is something that's not with you. It's at that point where you feel you should go ahead and like fight for the protest or like protest in the worst possible way. I think how you can solve this problem is what like Abel tells you, right? Because that's this certain thing. Because Maduro is scared, yeah, but you can still go ahead and you don't have like only one alternative, that is re-election. You have other alternatives. One on just like giving economical aid, trying to go and like cater to the poor people or cater to their minimal needs, things that can actually like probably help them to have food on their table, help them to have like 3 meals a day and all that sort of thing. These kind of things is something better. Or they'll say you don't have money, you are probably economic recession. I think it probably costs more to go ahead and like conduct an entire election, right? And that is literally economically harmful for the country in of itself. You can resuppose that, and at least and I think then the comparative is on which side are people are able to like go ahead and like have better life. You can get that through these welfare rates. But why is this likely, right? Because if you want to stop a protest and you can't concede that you did something wrong, you will have to go ahead and like give benefits. You'll have to go ahead and give things literally what like Abel tells you. But second, on international things, right? You have like diplomacy. You can go ahead and like use the leverage that you have with oil, but also the other supporters that you have with like Russia and China. I think these are things that you can still leverage. I think it's not necessarily that like the country itself is blocked out for aid or like blocked out for like complete or any sort of like help, right? Because if there is stability within the country, which you get with time by giving these aids to people, and then you go ahead and like also negotiate with like countries, then you can actually actualize at least some benefits or at least like some trade deals or all that sort of thing. Because on their side, we are unsure how this election will actually pan out. We are unsure. Like they just say that, oh, you'll probably win. No, you lost trust in the current government. I don't know why you'll still go and like vote for. But at that point, if Maduro really wants to come back, he can still go and like rig it. So if it's again, people will still protest, oh, he rigged it again, because it's still a claim in the status quo. No one knows for sure whether it was a landslide victory or not. So he still claim that. And if he doesn't win, then it leads to like more power vacuum. Anything that we are unsure how it will like essentially lead to like people. Just claims that, oh, far right and far right. So it can probably lead to like, yeah, I'll take it later. And all that sort of thing. I think it's still uncertain, right? People who lost, the far left sympathizers, I'm unsure why they'll accept to be or like co-opt into it. You can still have protests because of these far left processes. So literally, the any impact that they want to claim of like stability, of peace due to election, it's like very uncertain in this debate. Yeah, POI.
Navakanth, hyperinflation does not happen in a day. Like giving money to poor people so that they can buy food. If you can come up with this idea in 15 minutes, okay, so probably Venezuelan government has already done this and tried this. Why does it still bad?
It's like a band-aid solution, right? Just giving it when there's like literal crisis happening. You see that, oh, at least Maduro is doing something for the people. This is something you can probably go ahead and at least if you can go ahead and like conduct like election on your side, you still have resources on our side. So these small things, something that you can do and like get public sympathy. At the end of the day, for a government to be stable, it has to like go ahead and like win or like should be accepted by like people. And on your side, doing a re-election will always lead to like more questions. You can't accept the result of the re-election. You can't completely tie the legitimacy of the government. The only way legitimacy can be done is trust. People trusting that, whether the election was right or wrong, this government stands for me. Whether Maduro is a good person or bad person, he'll probably do something that can benefit me as an individual. That is something that Maduro will have to do, right? Because I think state people are smart. So at that point, leverage is something that you'll try to go ahead and build within your community, within the people, and also within international bodies. Crucial, right? I think then this debate has to be judged where at least people's lives are not getting fucked more, right? On their side, we are unsure how it is going to be fucked. On our side, at least that people can get at least some benefits because of these protests, and it's very proud to oppose.
Thanking Opwip, calling op reply.
Just give me 30 seconds, I'll start. Cool. Abel, he, him went as Gallo, going as op reply. Poof. Starting on a self count of 3, 2, and 1. Let's talk about what Gov went about within this debate. First, they tell you that there exists backlash from neighboring countries. We've already symmetricized the American backlash and things like that. So let's not put this within this debate. The other backlash is from neighboring countries. We'll posit that at a point in time, Venezuela is probably a leading supplier in things like oil and other natural resources. What exactly is the extent of backlash that you can potentially get from your neighboring countries is something that none of Gov's side ever actually tell you. Because at all points in time, we'll posit that you have other governments that probably have a vested interest in whatever happens in the Venezuelan country and things like that. And whatever happens in the economy is something that's likely to affect these other particular countries in and of itself. So we'll posit that it's capable, or there is a possibility where what is the name of this regiment? That there exists this Maduro's regime that has the capacity to go ahead and satiate the interests of these neighboring countries in and of itself. Now, at that point in time, we'll posit because Maduro has this incentive to go ahead and ensure that he has international support and things like that, he'll probably go ahead and do this particular change in and of itself. At that point in time, this backlash from neighboring countries being that much of a detriment to the Venezuelan economy is something that isn't really proven from side. But the second thing that they go ahead and tell you is that you get lesser violence. Why is something that they're not really sure of? Because they tell you, because we went ahead and told you that by virtue of context PI, it's fair for us to assume that opposition party is skeptical about the election in and of itself. If I told you explicitly that I don't want to have a re-election, at that point in time, regardless of what happens in the re-election, I'll probably fight the kind of verdict if it's not in my favor in and of itself. So at that point in time, we're unsure as to why the opposition is unlikely to go ahead and commit violence if they go ahead and lose this re-election in and of itself. Because notice, in my first POI to Saksham, I asked him, why exactly is opposition skeptical about this re-election? Saksham tells you, I don't know. But then Khushi in her reply, in her whip, goes in and tells you that opposition is just scared of not winning. Why though? There exists a nationwide protest against this Maduro regime and things like that. Why exactly are they so scared of losing the next election? And that is where we provide you with the solution or the kind of reason. We tell you that the chances of the Maduro regime going around fucking over the elections again is just as much as high. And that is why there exists a certain amount of skepticism from the opposition party in terms of conducting a re-election. If that is in fact the case, then we'll posit that if the Maduro regime goes in and wins this election the second time in a row, you have just as much as violence, but notice you have lesser amount of resources to be able to contain this violence because you spend a significant amount of your national funding towards conducting a second consecutive election within like a span of like 1 or 2 months or 1 or 2 years, and that is way too short of like a time span to be able to recover from like your previous election expenditure and things like that. That time we'll posit you that the amount of violence significantly increases on their side of the world without being able to access any of the other alternatives that we as side opposition have gone ahead and told you within this particular debate. Right? We've already gone ahead and told you that the Maduro regime has an active incentive to stay in power at all points in time. With that in place, JAR says that you have so much of or you have less number of resources, so you can't go ahead and satiate like public interest and things like that. Fine, but the lack of resource is something that's like probably symmetric at best. At that point in time, we'll posit that the debate winning metric is unfortunately not there, but the debate winning metric is where exactly you're better able to utilize this kind of low amount of funding that you have in terms of ensuring least amount of violence and least amount of exclusive harms on both sides of the world. We posited that you can have the capacity of lesser amount of violence by utilizing the funds that you have in terms of probably having, even if it's just short term in nature, more amounts of like centralist policies or policies that just cater to public sentiment and things like that. At that point in time, you're better able to satiate public's like most important interest, which is not just democratic procedure, but the root cause of all that hunger for democratic procedure is for some level of autonomy or for some level of money in their hands that they can go ahead and use to buy food on the table and things like that. This is where the root cause of all the democratic requirements and things like that happen. We'll posit that when you're able to satiate public interest by giving them better policies that they actually care about, you're better able to remove all kinds of like questions on your back. You're better able to improve the level of like reduce level of scrutiny that your neighboring countries have on you by giving them certain amount of policies that can help benefit them as well. At all points in time, we're able to prove to you a maintenance of legitimacy within your country as Venezuela as a whole without having to cave into American interests and without having to go through a significant amount of economic downfall, but at the same time going ahead and ensuring that lesser violence actually happens because you're able to cater to the interests of people at its root. Very proud.
Thanking Gov reply, thanking of reply, calling Gov reply.
Hi, clearly audible?
Yes. Yes, yes.
So, yeah, shout outs before reply. Uh, First to teammates Saksham, Khushi, thank you for teaming up. Yeah, this has a nostalgia factor attached because Rahat, we were last year also. Pratha would understand. The secondly, shout out to SRC's Repsoc. I guess all of us have already praised them a lot. So yeah, you all are great. Thirdly, to Rahat OC, all Depsocs, Venki, SBS, Hindu. This has probably the largest inter-college collaboration which has happened year after year in India. So yeah, hopefully we'll continue that in future as well. These are usual shoutouts. I have one more in this tournament. To my girlfriend Diksha, you have been amazing to tolerate me. Yeah. Starting in 3, 2, 1. There's a fundamental assumption which OP makes throughout their cases that you cannot have any election whatsoever in Venezuela where people will agree to the result. If that were true, then Venezuela is really, really fucked up, and none of us can save it. Can save it in our 7-minute speeches. But let's just, for the sake of being comparative and good debaters, agree that there is a slight possibility that if we have re-elections, there would be some kind of stability, some kind of international acceptance, some kind of internal acceptance that okay, we have already spent too much money in 2 elections back to back. If we are getting these results, probably that's what people want. Probably let's just move on, etc., etc. But let's just say you that the election will lead to more protest crap. 2 clashes then. Firstly, on what are the incentives of Maduro's regime and what is the likely way in which they are likely to act? Because in a THBT X should motion, you have to prove the likelihood of whatever you want X to do. Problem is, OP has forgotten that. OP wants X, which is Maduro's regime, to make like magical economic policies which help people which also appease Argentina, Chile, and not even legitimately listening to or for like agreeing to legitimize the validity of this Maduro regime in the first place, but also which is somehow able to counter not only US sanctions which have historically been there, but worsening US sanctions. Because US is saying that we do not want to deal with Maduro, we do not even see Maduro as a legitimate actor, so we'll even fuck you even more by improving the number of sanctions which you make. And if Navakanth's answer, one liner which comes in with, is that China and Russia help you. I don't know what kind of this help is this. I don't know why this help is significant enough. I don't know why US will not be angry even more when China and Russia are the ones who you go ahead and like talk to or seek help from. If that is the case, then the binary in the debate for Maduro is clear. Either A, you continue to go ahead and like create a environment of terror because you want to continue a regime. But the problem with this is very simple. There will be continued protest because protesters want like either disclosure of results, voting results, or like toppling the regime, etc. But also you do not but also you won't get foreign legitimacy unless you take some kind of political action. The implication or conclusion of this analysis is that protest like the current status quo is going to get worse off in future. So we are not debating on the harms which will accrue. All we are saying is that if you do nothing and you can't do anything and you can't do what like Abel wants you to do, that is be lenient because of obvious reasons and because of everything which we have already told you. So if you don't do what we are saying, or if you don't have any other future likely alternative, then the situation is going to get worse off, which unlocks every harm which they want to push on us. People do not get food on the table because economic hyperinflation will keep on getting worse and worse. People lose jobs. People are not able to feed themselves. Protests increase. Conflicts increase. People die. So this is the harm which they had to solve on their side. Their solution is a band-aid solution in Nawaz's words. I don't know why that's the best thing in this debate. But secondly, how then do we solve it? We bring in foreign legitimacy. If on both sides of the house, internal situation is fucked, internally people will remain polarized and internally people will remain dissatisfied with the government. I think even then, the exclusive thing which is only happening on our side is that the newer election results will get legitimacy from foreign actors. This is important. Abel does, like, I know Saksham is difficult to track, but Abel should have listened. We gave you in Saksham speech what are the harms of future of like the non-legitimacy by foreign actors, which looks like you not being able to sign treaty or ratify the treaties which were signed earlier, which means you cannot continue functioning as an economy, you cannot trade with these economies, you cannot make these wild economic policies which Abel wants you to do. All of this is unlocked uniquely on our side, which means economic situation becomes better off by UN aid, by other international organizations aid, only on our side. But let's take our worst case. I'm going to do a stupid thing. I'll say uncertainty is good because the alternative is certain harm. Yes, election may or may not cause protest, but at least we get that buffer time where we have peace, where we have stability, where we have a chance and a hope of peace in future. We do not want that to be taken away from people of Venezuela proud to propose.
Thanking government reply. With that, we come to the end of the Open Grand Finals for Rahat 2024. Congratulations to both teams again.